So in today's workshop, there's really actually two goals. We want to begin to explore different ways of understanding the system surrounding the problem you're working on and the different ways of mapping it out. And in so doing, to support you to think in a more expansive way about the problem and about all the different forces that are driving the problem. And through that, that mapping exercise, you develop really some novel insights and ideas that could lead to novel interventions. We want to do an exercise around reframing the problem to develop a guiding star. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. I think we found for this session, with things being a little bit slower online, is that doing the third activity in the session is going to be a little bit difficult. So we'll come back to that, and I'll talk about it at the end. So for today's agenda, we're really going to have two major activities where you'll be working with the rest of your team. We're going to bring back the system innovation framework that we used during the Nidan case study last week on informal workers, and try to populate that as a way of beginning to explore the system surrounding your chosen problem. And then we're going to start to draw some maps using the iceberg model, which you may be familiar with and for which there was a video in your pre-work. And we're gonna try to go through that and begin to build an iceberg for your project. I'm going to talk a little bit about causal loops and causal loop mapping, and share some resources that can be useful to you if you want to try to employ that mapping technique as well. So overall, the goal is to give you some tools and mapping techniques that you can try on today and make sure you at least are familiar with it and feel comfortable with them. We understand that at this very early stage, you're not going to be in a place where you even have enough information to really do this in detail. We expect that you'll come back to these techniques as you go a little bit further along in your research and use that to begin to build your maps. You don't have to use all the maps, but we're going to give you a set of tools to work with. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit last week, but very briefly to refresh, what is a system, or what comprises a system, I guess. A system is an interconnected set of elements that is organized in a coherent way and in a way that accomplishes something. So systems have a function or they have a purpose. We usually talk about a function when we talk about technical systems like a thermostat, and a purpose when we talk about social systems. So to break it down, systems have to have three things. They have to have elements. Those could be institutions and actors. They have interconnections. Those are relationships between those stakeholders, but they can also be flows of resources, flows of information, flows of other resources. And then finally, a system exists for a reason, has some kind of underlying purpose, whether that was intentional and explicit or something that is kind of implicit and became a property of the system. It exists to do something, and understanding the purpose is critically important, because a very important step in shifting a system is actually reimagining that very purpose. And this is kind of a simplified version of how to think about a system transition. First step is to start to map the system itself, as we're going to begin doing today. And by mapping the system, understanding the patterns, understanding the deeper forces that are holding the system in place, you can identify where there are some leverage points for change. Second is to then reimagine the purpose of the system. So how can we frame it differently, maybe in a more aspirational way, that shifts some of the underlying dynamics of the system, might allow us to actually come together and work towards a different outcome and a different purpose. And then finally, from there, using your identification of these potential leverage points, having been able to reframe a more aspirational purpose for the system, you can identify where those leverage points are and where small action can make a really big difference. There are lots of different ways to do systems mapping. We're not going to tell you or have to do exactly one. We're going to introduce a couple and give you some resources to use them, and you can decide what kinds of systems mapping tools you want to use for your own projects. But the two that we're going to focus on today, in addition to the systems innovation framework, which is a really nice kind of preamble to doing some visual mapping, is the iceberg model. And then we'll talk briefly today about causal loop diagrams and causal loop systems maps. So for our first activity, we're going to revisit the system innovation framework that we used during the Nidan case study last week. All of you did a great job helping to kind of fill this in together. And this is a really nice matrix for understanding both the stakeholders and then some of the relationships and configurations between those stakeholders that are really driving the system. And you recall that we sort of did a before Nidan and an after Nidan version of this. So we're going to start today by trying to think about the system for your project as it exists right now. And as you recall, there's 5 components to the system innovation framework. There are roles. So roles is really your list of stakeholders, right? Who are the different actors in the system? Try to list as many of them as you can and start to think about kind of who does what and how. Second is power. So what are the power configurations in your system? Who decides what? Who has power in the system? Maybe who lacks power as well, as we found last week. Informal workers had a big stake in the system and were tremendously affected by the way the system was designed, but had almost no power at baseline to influence really any aspect of the system. Third category is resources. Who gets what? How do resources flow through the system? Resources can include tangible resources like goods or financial resources, also more intangible things like flows of information. Networks, who connects to whom? So if you look at these, this list of stakeholders, what are the configurations and what are the relationships? Where are the little arrows that connect different groups? How are they connected? And where are those relations strong and where are they weak? And then finally, meanings and values. So this kind of gets at the system purpose idea. This is the why. Why is the system the way it is? What is it meant to accomplish? Whether that's implicit or explicit. So those are the 5 elements. And what you may also get to is trying to just identify whether there are some underlying norms, habits, or kind of rules of the game that might be driving what you're seeing in any one of these categories. Don't worry about that too much. I think your goal in the beginning is really going to be to try to list out all the stakeholders you can, work your way across this matrix. If you can articulate some norms, I think that'll be useful, particularly as you get into your iceberg. But let's see where we get to. Okay, so let's move on to part 2 of this exercise, and that's the iceberg model. I recognize that this is not a picture of an iceberg, it's a picture of an ice and some mountains, but it looks nice and it's close enough. Before we start, I just put into the chat a quick reminder for anyone who feels like they still need some more clarity about what's expected from the GoTo project, what the specific outputs are, or what makes a good GoTo project, that we have a page in Canvas that I've put a hyperlink to, GoTo project overview. So there you will find a video where I talk about what makes a good project, and also the assessment criteria and what we would hope to see in your final outputs, which are the presentation and the final report. So good to refer back to those if you haven't seen them yet. Terrific. So let's move on then and talk about the iceberg. Let's move on then and talk about the iceberg. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this. Hopefully you've watched the video that was part of the pre-work for this. The basic idea here between this conceptual model for systems mapping is that, an iceberg, the majority of an iceberg is beneath the surface. So what you see on top may only represent 10% of what actually is going on there. Systems are much the same. We have visible phenomena that we can see and observe and measure that are kind of above the surface, but actually the forces driving the system are much less visible unless you actually go out and try. And in fact, the deeper you go into the system, the more power you have to shift it. So there's 4 levels to the iceberg model. 1 is above the surface and 3 are below the surface. So above the surface, of course, as I said, are the events. These are the observable actions and phenomena, the stuff that happens, the problems that you see that you want to fix. The next level down, just beneath the surface, are patterns. These are trends that you can see over time, as observable patterns, trends, stuff that you can usually kind of measure. Those can sometimes be market forces or incentives. Going down a level deeper is structures. These are the rules of the game. These can be policies, these can be laws, these can be norms. They can be written or unwritten rules that actually drive the architecture of the system, if you will, and kind of form those patterns. And then finally, the deepest level of the iceberg in the deepest level of the system are the mental models, right? These are less tangible. These are the norms, the ideas, the belief systems, and the mental models that are ultimately driving everything else above it. It's kind of why the system exists the way it exists, why we accept it the way it is, and what our belief systems are that are fostering it. And let's do an example from the Nidan case study. So we had great discussions with you last week around the informal worker sector in India that Nidan worked with around street vendors and then other groups of informal workers as well. So just to pull out a few threads of some of the things that you brought up in that conversation and kind of where they would go in an iceberg. So, we could list a whole bunch of visible events, but I just sort of put a problem statement at the top there that ultimately the issue from the perspective of street vendors that they're excluded from the formal economy and are trapped in cycles of poverty. Some of the patterns, by no means all of them, but some of the patterns that you elucidated last week was that harassment of street vendors was really common, harassment by both, mafia and organized crime type groups that would take bribes for protection, but also by local authorities and by police as well. Another pattern was that in most places that Nidan was sort of engaging, they found that street vendors were totally dispersed. And in fact, there was limited data on the sector so that there wasn't great visibility into some of those trends and actually how big a problem there was. There wasn't even clarity on how many informal workers there were in the country at the time. In terms of structures, one of the most important things that we talked about was that access to services, the way that a lot of social services as well as financial services were organized in India is that it required formal employment or formal registration. And so if you were excluded from those formal aspects of society and the economy, you were not able to access those services. There was no legal recourse for informal workers in the event that they weren't paid for their work, for example, if they were harassed. And that national government was structured in such a way, or at least viewed their role as sort of, this isn't our problem. They said that we're a decentralized government, quote unquote, urban policy is a role for local governments, but at the role of the national government, we deal with livelihoods and other things. This isn't a livelihood problem, and it required a lot of advocacy to get them to engage and actually engage in the sort of policy conversation around this problem. Some of the deeper kind of mental models that we uncovered in that discussion was this kind of like a commonly accepted belief that, or view that street workers are kind of a hindrance, that they're maybe even a little bit less than human. Sometimes there were certainly class issues as well, that they're an eyesore. It's ugly to have informal street vendors everywhere. I'm not recognizing the benefits that they bring to people, but really thought of in that way. And kind of this notion that informality implies illegality, that there was something unseemly about this whole thing. And these people doing this stuff that was, reinforcing the marginalization of this particular community. So those are some examples of how stuff kind of fits in the iceberg. And what's worth knowing here is that, as you go deeper in the iceberg, it's a little more difficult to sometimes articulate these forces because they're less tangible and they're less visible. But what's really important is that your leverage increases the deeper you go in the system, so that being able to shift targets or information flows at the level of patterns can have some effect, but it's really when you get down to rewriting the rules of the game, reconfiguring power dynamics, and changing mental models, that you can actually create the most impact from any given intervention or change. And here I just want to highlight one of the readings from your Introduction to Systems Thinking section from last week by Donella Meadows, who talked about leverage points. And she's really one of the foundational thinkers in this space. And she lists 10, not 4, but basically makes this point that the deeper you go in the system, the more leverage you have to create change. And that ultimately here, the hardest stuff to shift is the most impactful. So changing the distribution of power, reconfiguring power as we saw in Nidan, changing the goals of the system, and ultimately shifting mindsets about why things are the way they are is the most powerful. So what we want to do now is have you have a go at starting to develop an iceberg model for your system. And once again, we don't expect that you have all the information you need to do this completely or perfectly, particularly within a limited amount of time, but we want you to have a go and just start this. So for the top level for events, you can start by listing out some visible events or phenomena, some symptoms of the problem, if you will. If you want, you can also just stick your problem statement, if you've got one, right at the top, use that as a place to start, but work your way down, patterns, structures, mental models. Try if you can to at least get a couple of each in each layer. And I think that'll be an important start. I'm realizing in the last slide I didn't talk about untapped resources, so I just want to go back to that and talk about what I mean by that. So look in the lower left here. Thinking back to our conversations from last week, some of you pointed out some really interesting stuff when we were mapping the before of Nidan, and that was that, first of all, the informal workers provide an incredibly valuable service that almost everybody uses and really everybody benefits from and appreciates, right? Really convenient access to low cost goods and services. And they're actually an integral part of the economy. They may be taken for granted, but they add a lot of value to most people's lives, actually. Another point that was made was that just by virtue of the nature of the work, that street vendors, as an example, have a tremendous amount of intelligence about flows of people, about market dynamics, about who goes where and who wants what and when and how and where. And actually that information could be incredibly useful with things like urban planning. So in a smart city initiative, they could provide a ton of useful information that could allow for proper design of a city layout and of services, if only they were given a seat at the table. So those were two things that existed even in the dysfunctional system that was marginalizing them. And when you were able to reframe it and make those things assets, that helped to really shift the underlying dynamics. So those are some examples of untapped resources. Some really nice progress. Got to check in with a lot of groups. I think some groups seem to find the iceberg a little more intuitive than the systems innovation framework, and there was some variability on that. I think a lot of examples of how it highlighted where you still need to do a little bit of scoping of your system, or a little bit of just generally getting smarter and doing some real basic research to kind of understand. But what I heard from a number of groups was that they were interested in really trying to understand where sort of the need and potential impact is greatest as a way of deciding where to focus on their system. And I think that's a really nice approach if that scoping sort of dimension is not obvious to you. But it looks really great. And again, this is just a starting point, but I encourage you to return to this as you continue with your research and use these frameworks in thinking about where you want to get to in terms of an understanding of the system in a way that can actually inform you with your data gathering, right? Both your secondary research and even planning what kind of questions you want to ask in some of the interviews that you may be doing over the coming weeks. We talked about leverage points and how the deeper you go in the system and the deeper you go in the iceberg, the more leverage you have for change potentially. So one way of thinking about this, if you go back to the Nidan case, how we kind of mapped the system before Nidan and after Nidan, so you could see what shifted as a result of some of their interventions. You can sort of build this iceberg as it exists right now. You can kind of work your way back up the iceberg as well in terms of thinking about what the opportunities are for interventions or kind of system shifting opportunities there are. It's preliminary for that now, but you can sort of come back to come back to this, and that's one of the reasons that this particular model can be quite useful. In the time we have left, I want to just introduce the sort of concept of causal loops, which is another mapping technique. And you really need to get a little bit further along in your research before I think you'll be able to sink your teeth into this, but I want to introduce the concept and some resources for you. And then we can continue to work on this over the next couple of weeks. So the basic idea behind causal loops is that you've already identified all of these forces that are driving your system, that are sometimes holding it in place, right? And you can actually take some of those forces and look at how they're related in terms of cause and effect. And what you find is that in systems, that cause and effect tends not to be linear, but instead tends to be circular, right? That different forces tend to either reinforce one another in a way that creates a positive feedback loop, or balance one another and creates a kind of negative or stabilizing feedback loop. So a really sort of basic example of a feedback loop would be supply and demand, right? As a way of a kind of a stabilizing or negative feedback loop. So if you take the fuel, for example, the price of petrol, as the price of petrol increases, that's going to drive down consumption, right? Because it's more expensive. And so a plus here in the increase of the price of fuel leads to a decrease in the use of said fuels, right? And if you decrease your use of said fuels, you're going to have an increase in fossil fuel reserves. The supply is going to increase, which will in turn decrease the price of fuel, right? So if fossil fuel reserves go down, the price goes up, but obviously vice versa. So ultimately, this is a loop that regulates the price of fuel, just simply based on supply and demand. You're MBA students, you've just worked your way through finance and economics and a lot of other far more complex things. So hopefully this basic idea makes sense. But with causal loops, all you basically have is you have a cause and you have an effect, you have an arrow connecting them, and you have plus and minus signs to show whether that relationship is a positive one or a negative one. And as I mentioned, there's two basic types of feedback loops. There's negative feedback loops. A great example would be a thermostat, which keeps your room a temperature or heating system, right? Your thermostat is set to keep the room at a set temperature. And if the room gets a little bit cooler, it flips on the boiler, and the boilers heat up the radiators heat up the room, and the temperature goes up. And when it exceeds that limit, everything kind of shuts down, or maybe even a cooling system comes on, with the ultimate goal of trying to reach a kind of equilibrium of temperature. In social systems, it's the same kind of thing, and you can see a negative feedback loop be stabilizing, like with regulating prices according to supply and demand, but also stagnating. It can actually keep things from getting better. Now, I don't want to, these are really, really simplified examples, right? And so, of course, there are a number of other factors that may, determine the price of fuel, policy levers, how the reserves are deployed, and, a bunch of other things. But this as a starting point just kind of shows you the general concept. Now, the other kind of feedback loop are positive feedback loops. These are avalanches, right? Or kind of snowballing effect. There's a lot of ice and snow in our workshop today. It's a very wintry theme. So positive feedback loops is when one thing begets another, and it becomes a vicious cycle or a virtuous circle. So a vicious cycle you can see here where the sort of intersection between low literacy, employment, and poverty levels can all be mutually reinforcing in a way that can be really destructive, right? So that a family living in poverty is going to have decreased access to education. Those lower levels of education will in turn make them less employable and lead to higher levels of unemployment. That obviously hurts income and leads to greater levels of poverty at kind of a population level. So that's a kind of a vicious cycle of things getting worse and worse. But you can also see virtuous cycles of making things better and better as well. Now, building causal loops is something that you can actually do as a next step towards some of the work that we've done this morning. So for example, if you take all of the different forces that you've identified in your iceberg model, what you can do is sort of pull them off of there and try to cluster the different forces in ways that seem connected or seem organized. You can organize them around themes. And then from there, you can either organize those themes or those forces into meaningful sequences of cause and effect, right? This causes this causes that causes this, and begin to put them together into meaningful loops. And ultimately, that's how you start to create causal loop maps. And of course, a typical map would be not a single loop, but multiple interconnected or intersecting sets of loops. Sometimes you'll find that there's a real deep structure, that there's a loop or a couple of loops that are really describe the central forces in your system and what's really driving things, and everything else around it kind of feeds into that. Here's an example from a task force that was looking at financial inclusion and access to banking services in the US. What they found was that one of the central driving sort of loops was a mistrust in financial institutions that was actually leading people to be less likely to access banking services in the first place. Their underbanking then led to increases in financial stress. The fact that they were now in a situation of more financial stress made them in turn less attractive to banks in the first place as potential customers, and made the banks less responsive to those particular individuals. That in turn leads people to be more mistrustful of banks because they don't really have me in mind, they don't care about me, I'm not the kind of person they want around, and that becomes a reinforcing vicious cycle kind of loop. Now, causal loop diagrams can get really complicated, and I know this will make your head spin to look at. Don't worry about the details. Don't think that we're expecting a map that looks like this from you in your go-to project. This is a beautiful map that was created by a commission here in the UK, a government commission looking at obesity in the UK. And actually, Patrick Vallance, who's the chief scientific advisor, who's always on television talking about coronavirus, actually led this work. So this was years of work that led to this. Two things that I want to show. Obviously, there are many forces, dozens of them and hundreds of arrows. What you can see is that there's a deep structure in the center here that they built around the notion of energy balance, how many calories come in, and how many calories go out as driving this. But then when you actually look at the different components or the different categories of forces over here, you see it's not just, as we might think about this, a biological or a medical or a health related issue. There are infrastructure elements to this. There are nutritional elements. There are economic elements. There are social, psychological elements. There are issues around media, access to healthy foods and food deserts in certain neighborhoods. It's a tremendously rich system, actually, and all of those forces are feeding into the problem. And so if you just focus on the medical aspects of things, you're probably going to miss the boat, actually. And so one of the reasons that system maps are so useful is that they give us that very expansive framing about all of the different forces that are driving the problem. We'll include some optional sessions over the next couple of weeks for people who want to do it in more of a workshop setting. What I encourage you to check out is the Systems Practice Workbook. It's on this Canvas page, this workshop Canvas page. And it gives you a really good step-by-step guide to a system mapping and system transition process for a small group like yours. And it includes a step-by-step of moving from identifying those forces to trying to play with and build some causal loops. The other resource that is mentioned on the Canvas page for this session is a tool called Kumu, and I also would encourage you to explore this. This is a visualization and mapping tool that makes really beautiful and pretty elegant, sort of visual systems maps. It's fairly easy to use and it's powerful, particularly for kind of making pretty slick or interactive looking maps where you can have a lot of information and actually play around with it live. It's a free to use tool, and there are two templates in Kumu that you may find useful. The first is a stakeholder mapping tool. The image here is an example of that, where you're looking at stakeholders around PayPal. So these are kind of individuals, but you can see who's connected to whom and who's connected to what. You can sort of determine what kinds of relationships there are and have different colored lines and arrows mean different things. It's really easy to use and organize for doing a basic stakeholder map. And then the second is a causal loop diagram. If you're doing causal loops, I would encourage you to probably start doing it manually with kind of the post-its and drawing arrows element in your Miro boards or even on paper. But if you really wanted to build one out, you can do a nice one using the causal loop template on Kumu. So two resources to check out. So where we're at right now is that we are in the stage of mapping the system, right? One of the things that we'll be thinking about over the next couple of weeks is how we can reimagine the purpose of our system as a way of really trying to iconically drive people in the direction of what's possible. And in the combination of really deeply understanding the system and finding those leverage points for change and identifying and articulating this aspirational system purpose are the ingredients that you need to then really identify your potential interventions, the places where you can act in ways that can really catalyze that system transition. So that's it. I'll sort of leave you with these thoughts, but we're just about at time now. In fact, we are at, oh no, wait, we have still 15 minutes, don't we? Hallelujah. My time management is all off because we're just doing these back to back to back to back. In that case, let me talk for another minute, and then we're gonna break out again for fun. So as you move forward, I want to keep these suggestions in mind, these mindsets of a systems thinker. We all want you to kind of walk out of this program with a systems thinking cap that you can use to address any kind of complex problem. The first is that, remember, wicked problems are unsolvable. Typically, they're problems that need to be managed. So rather than thinking about trying to get to a solution where there's like an end state where all of our problems are solved, think instead about seeking health. How do we create a healthy system or a healthy balance of forces that are delivering for people in a just and an equitable way, in a prosperous way? So the medical analogy would be a disease that we have no cure for, like HIV, where I can't cure your HIV, but with the right kind of management and the right treatment and the right interventions, I can help you to live a long, healthy, happy life, just like anybody else out there who doesn't happen to have HIV. But it's a process and it's a long-term process, right? So I want to seek a healthy balance of the right kinds of behaviors and interventions and treatments that are going to be able to create a healthy, happy place for you over the long term, right? So that's seek health, not mission accomplished. Second, super important, zooming in and zooming out. So here, what I want you to do is be continually changing your perspective. You want to dive in and go really, really deep at times, and then you want to step back and try to look at the entire forest rather than a single tree. We all have a tendency to only see the parts of the system that are proximal to us or sometimes that benefit us. And so two ways of overcoming those blinders is, one, to walk in the shoes of a lot of other stakeholders in the system. And you can do that in part by meeting lots of different kinds of stakeholders. And then the second is always to be kind of zooming out and looking at the way the different pieces fit together. But constantly adjusting kind of your aperture is a really useful way to to gain a kind of comprehensive understanding of the system. Third, when it comes to thinking about interventions, don't think about imposing change. It rarely works that way, especially from the top down. Think about unlocking change. Systems have self-reinforcing principles, and that's why leverage points are kind of tipping points where they can actually unlock properties of the system that can lead it to almost heal itself in a way. So think about how you can get all arrows pointing in the same direction and make some interventions that can actually unlock the possibility for change within the system. And then finally, systems transitions are not linear and they're not short-term processes. They tend to be long and circuitous, and they're riddled with missteps and learning moments, if you want to call them, as opposed to failures. But adopt a learning mindset. Try to cultivate a learning mindset on the team that you're working on so that you can continually be open to challenging yourself and your own mental models and continuing to adapt as the circumstances continue to evolve. So that's what I've got for today.